To know more such amazing stories from Indian history, click the bell icon and subscribe to Live History India.
This small patch of land is the site of what has been one of the most exciting and headline grabbing archaeological finds of recent times. Patnam, which many believe was part of the ancient port city of Muziris in present day Kerala. According to old Greco-Roman records, this was one of the great ports of the ancient world. A look at maps from old works like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea from the 1st century CE will show you that Muziris was just one of the many ports dotting the coast of India in a network that was vast, straddling continents. However, while the period between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE may have been the time when this Indian Ocean trade network was at its peak, trading ties between the subcontinent and Southeast Asia, Africa, and West Asia go back a long way.
When you look at the Indian Ocean as such, we have evidence from Egypt from the time of Ramses II, where we have a peppercorn from the nostril of the mummy of Ramses II. That is an important evidence that places the connection somewhere in 1300 BCE. Then we have evidence of traces of cinnamon in a flask, ceramic flask discovered in Israel. At these sites, they have done ceramic residue analysis and they have identified traces of cinnamon, which they believe must have come from South India. So we have these kind of evidences stretching back to 1300 BC, then 1100 BC. Like that way, we have evidences here and there. But when we come to the later half of first millennium BC, we have lot of evidences in terms of textual references as well as archaeological. One of the problem for the lack of evidence for the early period is that our focus has been entirely on the Indo-Roman or Roman trade period that begins around the 1st century BCE or little earlier. The reason for this could be the colonial notions that are prevailing or that were prevailing predominantly in understanding Indian history and archaeology. The beginning of Indian history and archaeology goes back to the time of colonial domination. When the colonial rulers came to India, they wanted to understand the people and their culture and their history. So they were trying to interpret the kinds of evidences they had, but they have the main focus of heliocentric or Eurocentric notions. These Eurocentric notions still prevalent in some contexts. This is where we need to do some kind of decolonize our approaches and perspectives, and also we need to deconstruct our understanding. So when we move from these traditional Indo-Roman to Indian Ocean perspectives, we embrace a holistic approach. It is not only because of the contemporary compulsion, or as such, when we are trying to look at the reality from a subjective objectivity, that's what I would call trying to be closer to objectivity. We should visualize this Indian Ocean in the center as a center of the Afro-Eurasian world, and diverse communities and people and cultures interacting. And this interaction was not only about commodities, it is about the people. The people are the center of these interactions. Commodities moved, ideas moved, ideologies moved, and also several agencies impacted these connections. So definitely these connections were multidimensional in nature. When we are trying to visualize this connection in terms of Indo-Roman trade, or as just a Silk Route or maritime Silk Route, or something like India, Southeast Asia, or India, West Asia, we are trying to see like the way the five physically challenged or visually challenged person trying to describe the elephant that occurs in Indian parables. In several Indian tradition, we have examples of these kinds of stories. So we need to move on from these narrow perspectives to Indian Ocean trade perspectives, and this is something very important in the current context. So when we try to visualize this from an Indian Ocean perspective, definitely we'll be looking for evidences not only about India or Rome, and looking for evidence from right from East Africa to all these ports that are distributed along the Indian Ocean, not only the Indian Ocean rim, but also the sites and settlements and network that are lying in the interior.
What Dr. Selvakumar is saying is that we need to look at the ancient Indian Ocean trade ties through a much wider lens. This, for instance, is an example of the roletted ware pottery found in the ancient South Indian site of Arikamedu, where Professor Selvakumar has done extensive work. The appearance of pottery pieces like this across sites from Odisha to Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Patnam, coasts of Africa and West Asia, going back to the 3rd century BCE, indicates that this area was closely linked through trade.
Roulated ware is one important ceramics that brings out the importance of Indian connection. Earlier, roulated ware was considered as a Roman ceramics, and some scholars argued that it was a Roman pottery and then it was imported. Later on, analysis by researchers, both the technological as well as scientific analysis, have revealed that this ceramics was produced in the Ganga Brahmaputra delta, probably somewhere around Tamluk or Chandragedugar. Now, if we map the distribution of Indian roulated ware, that is how it is known as Indian roulated ware. And we can very clearly understand this network is very much concentrated. The network associated with the roulated ware is very much concentrated on the Indian coast, mainly on the east coast, with a spillover right up to Pattanam in Kerala. So very clearly, by mapping the distribution of this roulated ware, we can understand the network. Roulated ware currently has been documented right from Egypt and also in some sites in Oman, for example, Korori or Smuram, and also in Sri Lanka, and in many sites in Southeast Asia. So this particular ceramics brings out the importance of Indian traders and their role in the Indian Ocean network. So if you look at some of the early literature, they were trying to characterize some of the Indian ports as Indo-Roman trading centers. So this, when you look at the evidence from these sites, for example, Arikamedu, there is very little evidence for the Greco-Roman presence, except some of the ceramics like amphora or terra sigillata or other materials. So when you look at the inscriptions on pottery, you will very clearly understand that most of the people who were settled at these settlements and who were trading were Indians. Indians, because we know it from the names. We don't have even a single name of any Greco-Roman merchants here. For that matter, we cannot argue that the Greco-Roman merchants did not visit here. What I am trying to argue is that predominantly that Indian merchants were dealing in the Indian sites. So definitely, we have literary evidence for the arrival of foreign merchants all along. So the roulated ware becomes one important material evidence for the connections across the Indian Oceans, in which India plays a central role, as it is, geographically located exactly in the middle of the Indian Ocean.
But the story of trade and its impact goes even further back. In fact, it can be said that it was commerce and trade that acted as a trigger for the transformation of the South from the Iron Age megalithic sites to the cities that evolved, starting the early historic period.
Actually, in order to understand the transition from the Iron Age to early historic, Iron Age we generally place in South India somewhere around 1300 BCE. We place the Iron Age somewhere around 1300 BCE. Then early historic till now, it was it is placed somewhere around 300 BCE. But recently, based on the evidence from Kodumanal and also Thandikudi and Kiradi, they have tried to push back the date to 5th century BCE. And this needs to be further researched. Currently, if we can take it as a kind of hypothesis that the evidence of script was introduced somewhere around 5th century or 6th century BCE, but we need more radiocarbon dates. Generally, with even 5-6 radiocarbon dates would not do. But what we see here, if you is in the Iron Age, if you look at the settlements, the material culture is very limited. So that tells us a definitely different story. If you this can be understood by excavating an Iron Age site and an early historic sites and the layers. The problem with some of the researchers is that they are not able to visualize the material culture that is coming from the Iron Age sites. So when you are in an Iron Age site, when you excavate the layers, look at the evidence, we predominantly get evidence for simple post holes and limited number of material culture. But when it comes to the early historic settlements, we see a spurt in economic activities in terms of diverse varieties of glass beads. Glass beads are found in large quantity, brick architecture, ring wells, and roof tiles, and so many material culture, intensive evidence for iron working, metal working, and everything, is found in the early historic context. So definitely interaction, I wouldn't say it is entirely overseas or long distance trade. Internal interactions within India also mattered, because if you look at some of the textual sources, for example, Arthasastra, it speaks about Pandya Kavataka, probably marine shells, and also pearls from southern India, and also textile from Madurai reaching. So this dynamic internal interactions, long distance, when I say long distance, it is not only across the Indian Ocean, even within Indian subcontinent. These long distance interactions and other overseas maritime interactions definitely gave a fillip. This fillip to this development, this we can very much understand from the descriptions in the literature.
This period of trade growth was also marked by the rise of port cities and great capitals in South India. Wealth was pouring in, and this also gave rise to a golden era of culture, of prose, poetry, and the fabulous Sangam age, a prolific period of high culture in the South. In fact, many poems from the Sangam period give us a peek into life and the wide trade networks of this time.
The literature clearly describes the urban settlements. They compare sometimes the urban settlements to a women. That is there in many of the poems. And whenever they speak about the cities or the towns, they mention about Valam Kedu. That is the Tamil term for Valam, means resource. Also wealth. So the poets very clearly speak about the urban way of life. When you look at the literature, if you look at Pattinapalai, other Madurai Kanchi and other texts, you can understand that these poets were really thrilled by the activities that were going on. One important verse occurs in the context of Musiris. Yavanar Tanda Vinaiman Nankalam Ponnodu Vandu Kariyodu Peyarum. Yavanar, the term Yavana. So when you work on the Sangam text, actually you can excavate the meanings, like the way we excavate archaeological sites. We can excavate the poems and the words and their meaning. So each words we can go on elaborating. Yavana, Yavana is a term occurring very frequently in Sangam literature. At least there are about 10 or 15 occurrences in the early times, and there are more occurrences in the later context. Yavana is a generic term referring to any person of Western origin. So here, this particular poem talks about Yavanar Tanda Vinayman Nankalam. So it talks about the ship of Yavana. So while describing the ship of Yavana, it says well-crafted ship. Vinayman means the poet sees ship and he finds it very beautifully crafted. Yavanar Tanda Vinayman Nankalam. Kalam is the word. Interestingly, the term kalam refers to vessel. Vessel in English is used for any household utensil and also a ship. Same way, the term kalam in Tamil is used for ship as well as any household utensil. So here the poet uses Vinayman Nankalam. It is a good vessel. And then Pun. Pun is a term used in Sangam literature for gold. Pun is used in different meaning. In some contexts, it could also refer to iron or metal. Ponnodu vandu curryodu perum. Curry is the pepper actually here. And very clearly, the poet highlights only two items, most important items that were traded. Yavanar Tanda Vinayman Nankalam Ponnodu vandu curryodu perum. That means the ships came with the gold and returned with the pepper, beating the white foam on the river Periyar. So this description also matches with what is mentioned in the Periplus, where it says the port of Musiris was not located right on the coast. It was 20 stadia. While describing the Tindis and Musiris distance, Periplus mentions about 500 stadia. Then the port of Musiris was located 20 stadia, which is 3.5 kilometer inside from the coast. So this particular description of Periplus matches with what is said in the Tamil text, that these ships, Yavana ships, entered into the river Periyar. That means they are moving from the sea into the Periyar and beating the white foam on the Periyar river. So that is a very beautiful description. This can be also interpreted. What I did was I tried to work on this literature minutely. You get white foam or other mainly these kind of foam only in the month of fresh rain, when it happens in the June-July time. So that it can be explained in that way also. There is another poem in mainly the long song of Pattinapalai, in which certain lines describe about the multi-dimensional network of Kaveri Pumpattinam. It talks about Neerin Vanda Nimirbari Puraviyum, Kalin Vanda Karungari Mudayum, Idathu Unavum, Kadathu Akamum. That is how the song goes. Here, the poet has very clearly visualized the horses that came by sea, and then pepper bags that came. It refers to kal. Actually, if you look at the medieval inscription, kal means leg in Tamil. Kal also referred to animals. So probably the pepper bags from the interior Tamil Nadu came and they were transported either on the back of the donkeys or in bullock carts. They came to the town of Kaveri Pumpattinam. And then this poem also mentions about the gold and other precious stones from the northern side. It also talks about sandal from Coorg. It talks about Kudamalai. Kuda in Tamil means west. In fact, even the geographical description is also very interesting. Now we call Arabian Sea as Arabian Sea, but if you look at the early Tamil literature in other texts, that was known as Western Sea. Bay of Bengal was known as Eastern Sea. So this description is also very important. So this particular poem describes how goods were coming from different directions. It also talks about Kadahathu Akamam. Kadaham is actually Kataha or Keda, which is in Malaysia. Idathu Unavum. Idam means Sri Lanka. Idam. So clearly, poet has seen the kind of activities that were happening, how the goods were coming from different directions, north, south, east, west, and that the poet describes. So we have several poems describing about these activities. There is another beautiful poem which talks about Kalam Tanda Purparisam Kazhithoniyan Karai Cherkunnu. So this poem is very important because it has probably certain Malayalam touch in it. The way the poet has constructed the word, Kalam Tanda Purparisam, Kazhithoniyan Karai Cherkunnu. So if you read it, you can feel that it was probably written by a poet who had some knowledge of Malayalam or influenced by that dialect. So here, what the poet says that the Roman ships did not enter directly into the port of Busiris. The ships were waiting in the sea, and then there were smaller boats, Kadi Toni. Toni is again another kind of ship or a small watercraft. Toni, actually, if you look at the later period, you have evidence of Thuthukudi Toni, that were used in the colonial time for transport between Thuthukudi in Tamil Nadu to and Sri Lanka. But the term Thoni is very old. It occurs in early literature. It refers to dugout canoe. What in Malayalam it is called Vatathadi Vellam. So Thoni means it. The term meaning comes from to dig, thondu, thon. So that is how it is called Thoni. It is a dugout canoe. And that particular kind of watercraft is mentioned in this poem. So we have several such poems referring to the activities, trade activities, the commodities that came to these port towns. So interestingly, we need not rely upon only these descriptions. So these descriptions perfectly match with what is represented in the Greco-Roman text and also by the archaeological evidence. That is why, when we look at all these evidences together, we get a holistic understanding.
The various references in Sangam literature are backed by material remains available through archaeology too. Dr. Selvakumar has worked on some of the most significant sites of this period, like Arikamedu in Tamil Nadu and Pattanam in Kerala, as well as the earlier megalithic sites.
From this excavation, what emerges is that the urban, so-called urban settlements, came to prominence in South India somewhere around 3rd century BCE. When you look at this settlements, you find innumerable number of glass beads and turbinella pyrum or conch shell bangle fragments, and then a lot of brick architecture, brick sizes of 40 centimeter in length, 20 centimeter in width, and 5 to 6 centimeter in thickness, and evidence of ring well, and also industrial activities for copper smelting, iron smelting, glass bead making, and everything. So from the excavation, we understand that these settlements were a kind of industrial quarters, probably controlled by merchants who were producing different kinds of goods. And they were using the site of Arikamedu as a port, and also as a market, and also as an industrial center. And they preferred the location of the site in little bit interior, not or right on the right on the coast. So the site is safely located in the Ariyangupam river, little inside, so that it would not have been affected much by the sea incursion or any other kind of activities. We have for the first time evidence of Roman pottery identified in this site in stratigraphic context, and some of these pottery were produced in Italy. They have this stamp of Italian potters. That is one important evidence. Also, we have diverse variety of amphora. These amphora shells were studied and documented by Elizabeth Lightingale. I was also participating in the documentation. From that, she comes to a conclusion that we find predominantly Greek amphora at Arikamedu compared to more of Italian amphora at Pattanam. And here she proposes a hypothesis that these Greek amphoras were used for wine, which was made out of sea water, which was brackish. She says that either these Tamils living on this coast preferred this type of wine. That is why we find more of this particular, Greek amphora shirts at Archaeology. So we get a lot of other evidences. We get to understand the kind of urban settlements, how exactly settlement existed about 2,300 years ago. So when you excavate a site, it's like walking into a settlement. See, possibly the site started in the late Iron Age. They have got a C14 date that places the site in 1000 BCE. So probably some limited activities at these areas, somewhere before, say, 5th century BCE at Pattanam. Then gradually the activities increases. When we try to map the ceramics, we found more, roulated ware occurring at a lower level than the amphora and other materials. Similarly, potteries of West Asian origin also occurred in the early level. So the picture is very clear. All along the Indian subcontinent, the trade activities, started first. That means the Pattanam was first well connected with the other parts of India. Then it was also connected with West Asia. Only later context, slightly at a later context, the Roman connections appear, because only in the later layers we are finding Roman ceramic evidence. Again, this is very tentative. The problem is, see, when you excavate a site where the deposit is very thin, say at the lower level, whether if it is 30 or 40 centimeter, and especially if it is a sand, the materials can go up because of the later disturbances. In archaeology, we call this as a site formation process. Site formation process. So I would say Pattanam has at least 3-4 phases. First phase is starting somewhere in 1000 BCE. Probably it was a small area where people spent for fishing along the coast or in the river area. Then comes connections with the northern part of India and east coast, and also then connection with West Asia. Then comes the Roman connection. Then the site also continued. Definitely, we should not visualize that everything stopped with the decline of Roman Empire. There was some continuity. People were, occupying the site, but the evidence after 3rd century is very limited. Probably there were some activities till about 5th, 6th century, 7th century. Then again, probably things came up in 9th, 10th century. So it is in this phase we are not very clear. We can definitely say that after 5th century, the site declined. But we do not know the intensity of activities. And then again, the site was reoccupied somewhere in 14th or 15th century. Again, we are getting late blue on white Chinese ceramics. So we have multiple episodes of occupation, but one interesting thing is the name Pattanam. The name Pattanam is very interesting. Probably the settlement was there, people were living continuously, thus they were retaining the name also. So definitely the name Pattanam is very important, because nearby Arikamedu we have the name of the village of Veerampattanam. And that is also very important. The Veerampattanam is identified with Veerai Munthurai mentioned in the Sangam literature. So clearly we have this place names giving us some kind of indirect clues to the existence of an old port in that area. The legacies of these trade network continues. So the connectivity has been always there. People were connecting, people were interacting, and we get evidences for this in all these phases. But only thing what happens is the nature of interactions were different in different contexts. The kind of interactions that existed in the early historic time, say around the beginning of Common Era and Christian era, were different. But the kind of interactions we had in the Pallava time was different. We have a strong political system emerging from 6th, 7th century, and the Pallavas were there. Then came the Cholas. They were trying to politically control certain parts of Indian Ocean, for which we have very clear evidence. Cholas had relationships with the Chinese. So, and again, from 13th century onwards, there is a decline of these trade activities, and here different kinds of forces, appearing, mainly the Islamic traders taking over the control, at least in some areas. Then again, the colonial intervention after 15th century, it really changed the picture. So the kind of interactions we had in the early historic, early medieval, and late medieval, and the colonial period, they were entirely different. One thing, what is here for the lay people is that we need to study Indian history beyond the Indian boundaries. Indian history cannot be understood just by focusing on Indian boundary as what we call India as now. So we need to try to understand the entire Afro-Eurasian history, how people were interacting. We need to visualize the entire area. Even the students should be taught about the entire Indian Ocean and the entire Afro-Eurasian world. Otherwise, they will not get this visualization. What really happens in history teaching, sometimes students from South India, they tend to study only Southern India. Students from Northern India, they tend to study only Northern India, not the other. And it is this in a globalized context, I strongly feel that we need to focus on Indian Ocean connections and also the Afro-Eurasian world history, how things were connected, how people were innovating. Roulated ware, this is what I have mentioned in many of my lectures. Roulated ware is one good example how India, this is one of India's innovation somewhere about 2,300 years ago. And later on, this particular ceramics is being found all over. I think these ideas we should take into the contemporary period and try to produce things. I think there is one important lesson that we have to learn, I feel, is that we need to be more production oriented, more innovation oriented in our university teaching, so that we can remain very relevant in the contemporary context. It is very important. These are some of the lessons to learn from history, from my point of view.
The fallen trade with Rome had an impact on the cities of ancient South India, but the ports continued to thrive till the medieval period. By the 17th century, new players had sailed into the Indian Ocean world. The Europeans who went on to manipulate and monopolize the vast trade. Sadly, it is they who dominate any conversation on the Indian Ocean trade network. However, today there is a conscious move to look beyond the West, how old ties across the Indian Ocean shaped cultures and ideas for millennia.